Hello, everyone. Welcome to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. Please forgive me for my voice on the intro to this episode. I have had a cold for the last week or so, and it seems to be a little bit difficult to make it not continue to suck a little bit. But thankfully, I'm not bedridden anymore, and that is definitely an improvement. This podcast intends to contribute to the developing discourse around psychedelics and their integration into the modern Western world. It does so by featuring conversations between myself and some of the leading and more cutting-edge we'll say advocates, spokespeople, and luminaries in the psychedelic culture. But not just in the psychedelic culture, but as well as on the fringes or frontiers of science, mental health, and philosophy. If this is your first time listening to the show, I hope that you do enjoy it, and you can find more episodes at jameswjesso.com, as well as subscribe on any of your favorite podcatchers by searching Adventures Through the Mind. It is also on YouTube. If this is not your first time, welcome back and thank you for your continued listenership. This show is entirely community funded through donations over PayPal as well as over cryptocurrency, though I've only gotten one cryptocurrency donation. I do foresee hopefully that it grows as I am beginning to appreciate cryptocurrency as the internet currency of the future. So I feel good about continuing to play my part in contributing to its active functional use rather than just as a quick ploy to make more fiat currency. With that being said, I'd like to give a big thanks out to Michael, who left a generous PayPal donation between this episode and the last episode. Thank you very much, Michael. I appreciate that. I'd also like to send a big thanks to all the people whose names are in the top corner of the screen if you're watching this on YouTube, or they're in the description to this podcast episode. They are my patrons on Patreon that are giving a very generous amount every month to not only this show, but my ongoing psychedelic journalism and this contribution to the discourse that I believe is part and parcel to my passions in this world. So thank you very much to those people. If you are appreciating the show and you would like to contribute to its ongoing development, as well as my ongoing development as a journalist and a writer, which is to say that you'd like to contribute to my time and energy put into writing various essays on topics around psychedelic culture, as well as in the next few months, the full immersion into writing a brand new book about my experiences with ayahuasca in Peru back in 2014, please consider heading to Patreon and becoming my patron. You can do that by heading to patreon.com/James W. Jesso. But any way that you would like to donate to the show is deeply appreciated. All links for that are in the description to this episode. Thank you very much. Onwards and into today's episode with Rachel Harris. She is a retired psychotherapist and the author of Listening to Ayahuasca, which is a book that explores her research around ayahuasca integration, in particular integration in a Western, we'll say fringe Western psychotherapeutic model. In the book, she explores her own journey with ayahuasca, as well as her own journey with, grappling with the implications of what her research offered, as well as exploring her research and the larger implications around it. I really enjoyed her book, actually. As any of you following the show know, I have a rocky history with ayahuasca. I'm not against ayahuasca, but I'm certainly not a cheerleading proponent of it in any way. And yeah, like I said, rocky history is the best way to describe it without shooting an entire podcast simply to explore my own ideas, which is what the book about my time in Peru will actually be about. I went into this book really unsure, very critical, and multiple times was like, I don't know about this, Rachel, like in the book, like writing in the margins, like, I don't agree, this kind of stuff. But as the book unfolded, it offered me a very reasonable and say self-aware discussion of the potentials of ayahuasca and the sort of like metaphysical, mysterious nuances that sort of give me a little bit of a like this, the way that my voice sounds, the way that my body's moving on YouTube. That's how I feel about some of the ideas that people put out around sort of the metaphysical or the ontological legitimacy of their experiences with ayahuasca. But her book really kept a humility in the fact that she very openly was like, yeah, I'm hearing voices in my head. What the hell does this mean? So this is it was really a great book. And so I was very excited to interview her. Although I intended for this interview to focus primarily on ayahuasca integration, there's a large focus in the middle about hearing voices and about a discussion around what does or does not denote a psychotic delusional state, and what may or may not be reflections of actually. It's just the language around is so difficult, around what is real and what isn't real, and who are we to determine it, and what does determine it, and whether or not the methods of biological psychiatry sort of like have their thumb on what is real, or whether or not they don't, and how we can handle that. So that was a very interesting aspect of the discussion. I'm glad that we went there, and I hope that you enjoy it. Of course, we do also talk about ayahuasca integration, which I think is very, very important. And all in all, I think this was a very good episode. I really appreciate Rachel's work. I really appreciated our rapport, and I really appreciated what she offered us here on the show and what she's offering in the larger psychedelic discourse. So please enjoy. One final note before we do get into the interview is I would like to say thank you for a 5-star review on iTunes. Malay711 from the USA says, I've truly become a believer in his work. He has opened my eyes, heart, and soul. I could never thank him enough. And thanks to all his guests he's interviewed or conversed with. Great work and an even better message. Well, you are welcome, Mel711 from the USA, and thank you for the effort you put in to leave that review. To the other listeners, you can leave a review on iTunes as well, and I will also read it on the show. So thank you. Kind of interesting, actually. I've noticed that sometimes I say the wrong words, and I don't notice that I've said the wrong words till later. If anyone listening happens to know if that's reflective of some sort of like brain tumor or something, can you get back to me about that immediately? Otherwise, maybe just forgive that in the spontaneous moment, I sometimes say the wrong word when I mean to say something else. I don't tend to do that when I'm writing, but when I'm speaking, it seems to happen quite fluidly. So maybe if you have any tips on how I could not do that, some sort of practice, I would appreciate that too. It happens at some point in this interview, and I'm sure you'll notice because it was really obvious, and I felt kind of embarrassed about it in hindsight, but oh well, here we are. Okay, that's it for the intro. Please enjoy my interview with Rachel Harris, author of Listening to Ayahuasca. Rachel Harris, Ph.D., although retired now, was a practicing psychotherapist for 35 years. She received a National Institutes of Health New Investigators Award, has published more than 40 scientific studies in peer-reviewed journals, and has worked as a psychological consultant to Fortune 500 companies and the United Nations. She is also the author of the recent book, Listening to Ayahuasca. Hello, Rachel. Welcome to the show.
Hi, James. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I really appreciate your demeanor that we've been like prior to the interview starting. It's
Yeah.
already it feels like a good rapport. So
Oh, good.
why don't you start us off in the interview today and give us what called you to researching ayahuasca and the extent of your research and your observations.
Okay, well, what's missing from my bio, and I'm not sure why my publisher edited this out, a couple of years ago, is that after I graduated from undergraduate in Boston, I went to Esalen Institute in California, which at that time was a growth center, um, and they were doing a lot of innovative groups and uh, a lot of there was a great interest in psychedelic drugs. So I was 21 and fresh out of undergraduate school. This is before graduate school. And I was in their residential program, which was 11 people and 6 months long. And we did body work and meditation primarily. And we worked really with the top people in the country, the top therapists in the country at that point. And I always feel like that's my foundation for all my work, for the therapy work I did for years in private practice, and also for the interest in psychedelics. When I left Esalen, I had to go re-enter the academic world and found my way into research. And so, lo and behold, pretty much as I was retiring after a long career, I found that I had the clinical and research training to be able to take a look at what was happening with ayahuasca in North America. And so that was the focus of my research that I published. And that came out in the Journal of Psychoactive Drugs in 2012. And I limited that research to what was happening in North America. I wanted to see what was happening as ayahuasca was entering the North American culture, the Western world.
Hmm. And so, can you explain the extent of your research, in particular, to what became the the underlying body of listening to ayahuasca, and what you went in to investigate with that book, and what your observations were at the end?
Yeah, sure. So the research was based on a clinical question, and that is what happens after the ceremony? How are people changed? How is their life different? How are their relationships different? This is the kind of question that therapists ask. Um, but I asked it in a research way. But what was unusual about the research is the interview schedule that people completed was 16 pages long. This is not something you do in research. It took them hours to complete. It was all essay questions practically, and people, completed that questionnaire, and then on top of that would write me personal letters and emails, and they really wanted to share what their experiences were. And so I got an enormous amount of qualitative data, and also I had a quantitative aspect. I think there were about 6 pages of data that could be quantified, looking at it was an adaptation of the questionnaire that was being used at Hopkins, studying mystical experience. So we looked at different aspects of mystical experience: a feeling of unity, ineffability, a sense of not being able to describe what the experience was. Those kinds of an overwhelming sense of love. Those were the kinds of questions that were asked in the quantifiable data. And I to develop the questionnaire, I interviewed a number of Western shamans who were well trained by indigenous shamans. And one of the women shamans, a very intuitive, lovely woman, said, ask people about their ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca. That was the phrase she used. And I was sort of early in my own experience. This was maybe 2006 or 7. And so on just faith, she was the expert, not I. I included that question, and I asked, how do you communicate with the spirit of ayahuasca? Um, how often, what's the meaning of this relationship for you? And I have to tell you that that was pretty much the shock of all my research career. I mean, when I got back, basically three-quarters of the people, there were 81 subjects. This is still just a questionnaire. It's still ground level research. It was not a control group. People were not randomly assigned. There are big limitations to this first entry into research for ayahuasca use in North America. Still, three-quarters of the people said they had an ongoing relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca. They communicated with her in dreams, in moments of quiet, in meditation. They could call on her for support, for emotional support. I mean, I didn't know what to, I didn't know. I was shocked at this finding. 75% of the people. I didn't know how to understand it. And the crazy part of it is that I had my own relationship with what I considered grandmother ayahuasca. And she was pretty much inspiring me to do this research study. And still I was shocked. So we're starting the interview with my craziest story about myself, I guess, is that despite the fact that I was hearing a voice that I felt was grandmother ayahuasca, when I heard from three-quarters, it's about 54 people out of 81, also had an ongoing relationship with grandmother ayahuasca, I was completely flabbergasted. So that was kind of the start of the whole exploration of what's the meaning of this. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, I'm a Westerner. I'm trained, in Western science, like Westerners are, and I hardly believed my own experience, much less my data. So that's where I started from.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Like that was a question I wanted to go into a little bit later, but I'm very happy to go into it now because
Here we are.
it's actually probably one of the biggest hangups I entered your book with,
Right.
because I went in being like, okay, I'm going to read this book because I had heard some of your interviews. I'm like, it seems very valuable. I'd like to interview you, so I'm going to go into your book. But I was really like, I don't know, ayahuasca. Like, I've had my experiences, some of them very troubling, and I have like I am not the interviewee here, but I have a history that started with ayahuasca and ended with ayahuasca over the course of 3 years, which I'm very happy to have completed, because the whole middle of it was very, very difficult. So I went in not really super stoked on ayahuasca. By the time I exited your book, I was like, maybe I've given this thing a bad rap. Maybe I need to look into this a little bit differently again. But the biggest struggle for me over and over again is the same struggle you talk about in the book, which
Yes.
is, like hearing the voice or the spirit of ayahuasca in your head. And I still have no idea how to integrate it. But I have a question that might be personal, so you could definitely answer it using information from the other people rather than your own experience. And this is kind of a personal question for me too, which is that how do you know that you're hearing the voice of ayahuasca? What does it even feel like to be like, oh, that's it? Like, how do you differentiate that between you maybe just talking to yourself in your head, and on top of that, as a therapist or formerly practicing therapist, like, how would you differentiate between this as being a healthy part of integration from an ayahuasca experience into a person's life, and what could be the signs of a potentially dangerous psychosis?
Yeah, right. This is a really important question. And it's actually a classical religious question from mostly Catholicism, actually. And in that context, it's the process of discernment. And that's a really important spiritual process. And it is asking the exact question that you're asking. How do I differentiate what this voice is? Whether it's part of my own craziness, which is the psychological aspect of it, or is it evil, which is the Catholic, point of view? Is it an evil spirit? I mean, they actually talk about that. And there's no clear-cut way to accomplish this process of discernment. So people do, even within even within the monastery, for people who are devoting their whole lives to this very question. How do I know what's guidance from God, so to speak, versus temptation from the devil? That's again a Catholic sort of context, which is kind of foreign to me. I'm not Catholic. I've just, I had read about this even before ayahuasca because it's a fascinating question. How do we discern the inner movements of our psychological spiritual life? And so this issue of this voice only makes it bigger. I don't have exact data to answer your question in terms as a researcher. I've interviewed a lot of people, even more than I report on in the published research. But there's no one clear answer to this. Everybody sort of finds their own way. So I'm afraid I can speak around this question clinically from clinical interviews and also from study about hearing inner voices, because there's actually a lot of interesting movement in that field right now. So for instance, generally it's assumed that if someone has schizophrenia and they're hearing voices, the voices are generally disturbing. They're saying disturbing things. They're harmful to the person's sense of self and well-being. They're super duper critical, way beyond just our normal neurotic, oh, you made a mistake kind of voice. That, we all live with that inner critic. That's not the voice. Schizophrenics really hear damaging, attacking, disturbing voices, often telling them to do things that are socially unacceptable, even to the point of murder. I mean, it can go very far. And so one of the really gross dividing lines is the voice constructive or destructive? That's a very first level of cut, sort of differentiating the two. And nobody reported a negative, destructive voice, assuming it was the spirit of ayahuasca. It was it was extremely supportive, sort of like the perfect psychotherapist. There was, they would always answer the phone.
Right.
They were always available. It was
which
like,
I want to ask you about in a second too.
Yeah, so it was kind of the perfect, always available therapist for people. So it was a very therapeutic, supportive, kind, loving, in some ways, a perfect therapist and mother. So there's that sense of that early attachment. And that's possibly part of what's healing about that ongoing relationship for people. But there were a handful of people who didn't report grandmother ayahuasca, but ayahuasca as a female temptress, and they had sort of a more sexual relationship with her. That's a whole different ballgame. But still, it's a positive experience. It's not negative or destructive. And so I went a few different directions with this voice, if I could lay it out. But I mean, the worst one for me is, well, this is an American reference, but George Bush was still president at the time I was doing this research. And he was saying his father in heaven, it was a religious reference, basically told him to invade Iraq. So then here I am hearing a voice telling me do the research. And I'm thinking, oh my God, how is this different from George Bush? Mm-hmm. This was the most terrifying thing to me.
Well, you're a highly educated psychotherapist, and George Bush was an increased insult here.
But still, it sounded the same. Uh-huh. I mean, how would I say it's different? And I found a fascinating book. The title is When God Talks Back. The author is Tanya Luhrmann. She's an anthropologist from Stanford. She's a professor there. And so she joined, this is a tremendous sacrifice, I think, on her part. She spent like 3 years in an evangelical church learning how to listen for the voice of God. And they have a system in that evangelical church. Think of the, the name of the church it's either the Grapevine or the Landmark. It's something like that. But you would find it through her name or through the title of the book. But it's a big evangelical church. They have churches all over the U.S. And they have a systematic process of teaching people how to hear the voice of God, or what they generally say is, I had coffee with Jesus this morning. Jesus and I sat down and talked this morning. So this is also very foreign to me and just kind of drove me a little crazy. And because I'm thinking I'm not going in that direction. Um, so there was this kind of worry that I had myself, but the data is the data, and I had to report it. Three-quarters of the people reported an ongoing relationship, and a relationship that they generally talked about as very therapeutic. And then just recently, I found a scholar in psychology of religion is his field. His name I can't remember right now. Lee Kirkpatrick, and he talks about God as an attachment relationship. And here again, we have this sense of a all-encompassing, loving mother, where there's a sense of attachment. This spirit is there for me always, always available, always supportive. So that's the general reading around which I did this. And I also discovered, Luhrmann talks about this as well, is there's a self-help group outside the psychiatric profession of people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia who have said, I've made peace with my voices. I hear these voices all the time. I've made peace with them. I either know how to block them out or ignore them, or maybe I've made friends with them, but they have found a different relationship with their inner schizophrenic voices than the psychiatric community even dreamed was possible. Mm-hmm. And because the psychiatric stance is, let's drug you so you don't hear the voices.
Right.
But they've found these are patients who have found a different way, which is fascinating.
Mm-hmm. I sometimes ponder whether or not shamans are generally, hopefully, people who might very well be schizophrenic, who have come to a very good terms with their hallucinations and have found some sort of way to harness it functionally to the betterment of their tribe or community.
Right, but then they wouldn't be locked up. Mm-hmm. They wouldn't be brought into a hospital because there's a place for them in their culture, and they're serving a purpose and a contribution. Mm. So they wouldn't be diagnosed that way.
So this is okay. So there's three pieces that are emerging for me that I want to unpack each of them. But the first one that I want to say, you just came up, like how do you feel about the way, we'll call it conventional biological psychiatry treats we'll say psychological turbulence of spiritual type experiences, such as with ayahuasca or possibly without ayahuasca? Like, how do you feel about the way that conventional biological psychiatry is going about this?
Well, I was in the Department of Psychiatry when I was doing research. So I participated in some of the family therapy programs for psychiatric residents, and they get very little therapeutic training, much less some kind of humanistic therapeutic training for dealing with a spiritual emergency. So they would never diagnose it accurately. So it's a dangerous place to go. If someone is having a spiritual emergency, entering into the psychiatric world is a dangerous thing to do. They will likely be drugged heavily. So I wouldn't wish that on anybody. And I recently, within the last year, had a good bit of contact and emails and telephone calls with someone who had a very difficult reaction after 2 nights of a weekend ceremony. So 2 nights back to back of ayahuasca ceremony with an indigenous shaman in North America. And she was having a lot of trouble and was basically unable to work, unable to parent. Her ex-husband moved back into the house to take care of their child. I mean, this was a spiritual emergency. And she was seen by a lot of different people, and nobody diagnosed that this was a Kundalini experience. And she just wanted to stop it. Now, so now we are way out of the realm of psychiatric
Well, you just used the word
conceptualization.
Kundalini, so
Kundalini. I mean, we
yeah.
are just way out in the bushes. And I don't know how you stop a Kundalini. All the symptoms. I mean, one description she said is, I feel as though I stuck my finger in a live electric socket, which I think is a pretty good description. So, but who would diagnose that? And so I was able to diagnose it. Well, bully for me, but I don't know how to treat it.
Hmm.
I had no advice for her. I had nowhere to send her. And what I did is I connected her to someone I know very well who had a Kundalini opening 45 years ago and has lived with it and worked with it and developed herself through it and made a therapeutic connection between these two people. But that person would not work with the person having the symptoms because she only wanted to shut it down. She didn't want to go through it. So you see how complicated this is clinically.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, how do you differentiate between somebody who's entering into a dangerous psychosis and somebody who's entering into a spiritual emergency? Like, is there a difference? And like, is the language we use and the implicit biases behind that the thing that defines a difference? Or is there actually like a difference? One needs to be medically treated. The other one needs to be spiritually treated.
You know, this is again a process of discernment. We don't, and it really would depend on, is it, if she went to a psychiatrist who had no idea of Kundalini symptoms, she would be diagnosed as having a break. Does that make it so? Or does my calling it a Kundalini paradigm make it that? These are just labels. And even there hasn't been that high reliability among therapists of all different disciplines in terms of just diagnosing regular neurotic symptoms. We're not that good at it. We've tried to be better with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual has been designed to sort of the Bible of the therapeutic community to have behavioral objective definitions of diagnoses, but we're still not that good at it. So we're even less good at something as difficult as this.
Right, like fantastic at diagnosing things, terrible at understanding why it's there and how to fix it.
Yeah, well, no, but I'm saying worse than that. I'm saying we're not even great at diagnosing. If there's not inter-rater reliability, we're not so great. So we have a lot to learn, and the psychedelic drugs take us into realms that we know very little about. And I don't think we really have a paradigm for them yet. And anybody who says, well, I know how to do integration and I know how to help people. No, I don't think we know. And we can maybe get lucky as therapists and be helpful. But this is new territory for us professionally. And I think we damn well better admit that it's new territory. Mm-hmm. And instead of trying to apply what we know and force it on top, these are realms we don't completely understand. Mm-hmm. Let's be honest about it.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
I mean, all you have to do is look at one of Pablo Almaringo's paintings to know that we don't know what we're talking about.
Right. Or even
exactly.
some of the more like the modern visionary arts culture and some of those strange free-based DMT inspired digital artwork that comes out.
We know less
right?
about that.
So let's get into the second of the three that I mentioned. And the second has to do with what you were talking about there with ayahuasca being, maybe these weren't your exact words, but like the perfect therapist. In your book, you really explore a psychotherapeutic approach to working with ayahuasca and integrating ayahuasca experiences. And I mean like psychotherapeutic approach to working with the ayahuasca experience, not necessarily using a psychotherapy model for the actual drinking of it.
No.
And one of the things...
Thank you for saying that. Thank you for clarifying that.
Mm-hmm. One of the things you talk about is potentially as ayahuasca being this secure attachment, and that the secure attachment can be really healing. Can you unpack that a little bit by maybe explaining why a secure attachment might be healing And I guess obviously that's asking you about like what insecure attachment does.
Yeah, that's a really big topic. The best book that talks about this is called A General Theory of Love. And it describes in layman's terms the attachment research and the process of psychotherapy, and even better, the process of choosing a partner in life. And but it really does, all the attachment theory stuff really emphasizes those early relationships with the primary caregiver, which generally is the mother. So you just use the shorthand of the mother. Um, and that, I mean, there's findings that show that early relationship influences the architecture of the brain. And so there are pathways and what feels familiar and normal that influence many of our other important relationships in life. So it has a lifelong impact. And people can have a secure relationship with a parent where they feel that the infant, this is a newborn, this is the first 12 months, feels that they will be taken care of, they're safe, their cries will be responded to, their needs will be met, so it's secure. And even as they begin to crawl away, to explore the world, they come back into the circle of the parent's arms to kind of almost refuel and then go out again. And there are wonderful videos, even very old videos from the 50s and 60s, where you see this little munchkin, this little 7, 8 month old crawling around and then, hustling back into mommy's arms to kind of refuel and then go out and explore again. And so it's a sense of a secure base that's responsive and safe. And without that, people can have insecure attachment or avoidant attachment or disorganized attachment where they seek, disorganized is the worst, where there's trauma, where there's abuse. So the person they would turn to, a parent, for safety and responsiveness is actually hurting them. So that's a disorganized attachment. And there is this sense of people tend to replicate these early attachment relationships in their choices with significant others in their life. So it influences their whole lives. So by now I've forgotten your question.
It was about the role of the why you feel it's important, an important observation that ayahuasca might play the role of a secure attachment in a person's psyche.
Right. Thank you. Right. So this is the work that Lee Kirkpatrick is doing with God as an attachment figure, really Jesus and the evangelical movement, is that a later relationship in life can, here's the term, can create, the person can have a sense of earned security. So if by chance that person falls in love with someone who has secure attachment and is kind and responsive and committed, then the person who originally had insecure or avoidant attachment can learn. In other words, the attachment category can change. They can learn to feel more secure if they make a very, very good choice. And usually luck is involved. And so there is this application then of this theory that this can happen with God as an attachment figure. There can be healing in that. And I think the same is true of grandmother ayahuasca as an attachment figure. So here's a story that a young woman told me, and this is a family where they had been refugees, let me think, in 2 different countries. So, there's upheaval in the family. She was on not just her third language, but her third alphabet. In other words, the languages were totally the alphabets were different. She was in her early 30s and had a terrible sense of self-esteem and was working very dedicatedly in ayahuasca ceremonies and with what she experienced as a supportive, kind, loving relationship with ayahuasca. And I could see her changing. Her sense of self was improved. She felt better about herself. She felt more secure and stable. She had really been kind of stopped in her life by her very low self-esteem. And she was now able to move forward in her life. In her early 30s, she had lost a lot of time already, but she was able to begin to move forward, that she felt good enough about herself. And that was what was healing in that relationship with the spirit of ayahuasca. I mean, I sound a little crazy talking about this, but I can tell you that clinically, it's very clear. She did not have therapy, because I asked her that, because it looked like she was having a good therapeutic response. I thought, well, this is because you're in therapy. No, she wasn't.
Interesting. I know that one of the thinkers and researchers that I follow a lot is Gabor Mate, Dr. Gabor Mate, and he talks
Yes.
extensively about the healing of trauma has to do with coming back into a sense of safe and secure connection that as an adult isn't with your parents anymore, it's with the universe in some way. And so I could see
Well,
how
that's a little abstract.
it is a
With
little
the
abstract. So
universe.
but his maybe I'm
But you
maybe
get,
unfair
the words,
characterization is
you
work,
know
but
he's
yeah.
building on attachment theory because the words are the same.
Yeah. I think it's like with the self and the self's connection to know that you are safe and present and full and complete and worthy
And
simply
that's a self
by
with a
being
capital
yourself.
S.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So it's and Jung talked about that too. That what's healing is the approach to the numinous. Again, the divine, the sacred. So whether it's within or without, that approach to the sacred, to the divine, is what's healing. It's a whole other level of healing besides some of the nitty gritty work that gets done in psychotherapy. This is a different level of healing that happens. And I think that's what Mette is talking about.
So let's get into a different level of healing, even down into that nitty gritty. So people have the perception of the spirit of ayahuasca, and that can be very healing because of this secure mother attachment, or maybe because, as a few of your research subjects outlined, because of the incredible sexual connection that could be there. But what about the experience of dark entities or parasitic entities that people carry with them? I know that in certain circles of even Western shamanic practice and indigenous shamanic practice, there's this belief in the spirit world, and that there isn't just it's not like you're just going in to meet grandmother ayahuasca, that there's possibly a battle going on there, and that there's other entities in the space, and some of them can harm you. And what's your thoughts on this in the larger sort of paradigm of ayahuasca integration work that you're talking about here?
Well, many Westerners have sort of wanted to ignore this and just focus on the positive, the therapeutic value. But there are enough reports of people having unusual, bad experiences with spirit entities that this takes us into a realm of belief, spiritual belief or religious belief, it's certainly different from a therapeutic model. And so I could cop out and say, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And it's true. I don't know. I don't know anyone who really knows. People have beliefs, but I don't know who really knows. But I do want to say I've heard enough stories that there's a real risk here. And so what I want to say, and I could come at this a couple of different ways, but this is the first opportunity you've given me, is I think it really makes a difference who you're sitting with in the circle, who's running this ceremony. And I just want to say, as a disclaimer almost, even though I'm talking about an illegal psychedelic drug, I'm extremely conservative.
Mm-hmm.
I really only want to sit with someone who's very, very well trained and has a real lineage of shaman behind them. And so I'm very, very careful about this. And I recommend that people be very, very careful who they sit with, because I think the creation of a safe space where whatever spirit entities need to be kept out can be kept out by a powerful enough shaman, a well-trained shaman with a lineage behind him.
Mm-hmm.
And
Whatever that might mean.
I just have to hope for the best for people. It's these kind of shaman are not easy to find, but I think that's where the real safety comes from. So I've now heard so many different stories where I just I want people to be careful, but there are not enough safe referrals for people. But I think I just want to at least come out and say, when it comes to entities that have a malevolent intention, our best security is with a very well-trained shaman who clears the space and protects the space and is present.
I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that at the end, because I have a question about people who are inspired here about how they can, what to look for and what to look out for. But I want to go into something else that you mentioned a few times in your book, which is people using ayahuasca and them becoming enamored by the visions they experience as possibly being spiritual materialism. And you even have an entire section of your book that's dedicated to exploring spiritual bypassing. Can you please explain these terms and how they relate to ayahuasca use?
Well, I was here's the best. I have a relationship with a non-dual teacher. Well, he wouldn't even let me call him a teacher. He's a non-dual friend. I mean, that's how uncommercial this person is. And so as I described some experience I had had, he said something like, so the experience had a beginning and an end. You know where he's going? And I said, yes. So. Yeah. And he said, so it was transitory. Yes. But people collect their ayahuasca experiences, devote books to them, and gather them as if they mean, because I've had this experience, I am therefore, that means something about me. Mm-hmm. And no, it really doesn't. This is a transitory experience that opens up another learning opportunity, but it doesn't necessarily grant you any spiritual status. Mm-hmm. So the collection of spiritual experiences, whether from ayahuasca or meditation retreats or anything, is just a collection of transitory experiences.
Mm-hmm. Which is what you mean by
which are
spiritual materialism.
They are impermanent. But people collect them as if they have meaning, as if they're like graduate degrees, that they have meaning of some sort, and they bestow, they make me something. And so they use them to self-aggrandize. Well, you wouldn't believe the amazing experience I had. It's that's, and there can be competitions with this, and, competition is, I can outdo your spiritual experience, mm-hmm. that sort of thing. So I think those are warning signs. But a spiritual bypass is a little more complicated, because that's where the experience is not just used to brag about my spiritual development, but it can be used to avoid doing some basic work that I need to do. That's just when I was in private practice, I used to say, I specialize in kindergarten. I want to do the therapeutic work that's the foundational work. And that's, what was your family of origin like, your relation, it's the basic family work. And because there is no getting around it, it is always there. It's always an impact. If we don't have good consciousness about it, we are going to act it out in our lives. So a spiritual bypass is when I would use a spiritual experience to say, well, no, I don't need to look at that. I've grown beyond that. So I think the example I give in the book, you might remember, is a woman came in to talk to me about her experience of grandmother ayahuasca as the divine feminine, and how this was inspirational for her as she was in her 20s and developing her sense of self as a woman. And she had this whole thing, and she went on for 20 or 30 minutes about the divine feminine until I basically couldn't stand it anymore. And I said to her, and so how's your relationship with your mother? And she burst out in tears. That's where the work needed to be done. Mm-hmm. So that's a spiritual bypass. I'm going to talk about the divine feminine. Meanwhile, I haven't done my therapeutic work on my relationship with my mother. Mm-hmm. And that's where the work needed to be. But in that case, it was used as a defense mechanism. And that's what a spiritual bypass is. It's a defense mechanism.
Yeah, interesting. I know that I've read Robert Augustus Master's book on spiritual bypassing, and some really great insights there about how we all do it to some degree or another, and we'll continue to do it over time and discover it slowly. I mean, same to be said about spiritual materialism and I want to clarify something, because it was mostly clear for me, but just in case for the listeners, when you're talking about the ayahuasca experiences as being sort of notches on the belt that define your worth simply by nature of having the notch, and believing in them as being meaningful unto themselves, and differentiating that from ayahuasca experiences being extremely meaningful personally, and the difference between having an ayahuasca experience that's very meaningful and leads a person to becoming a better person because of how it shows up in their life and how they show up to I think you said, learning that comes with it, and the assumption that simply by nature of having the experience, you're already a better person. Is that kind of a differentiation?
Yes, perfect. And so that's why my therapeutic question is, how has your life changed since the ceremony? How are you different? How are your relationships different?
Mm-hmm. And that goes into the last area, or second last area of curiosity I have for this interview here, which is, the question about relationship, which is a question as well about integration. Tell me a little bit. I know that you said, you made this important claim of like, nobody really knows like what integration is or the best way to do it, etc. But why don't you offer me what you believe integration to be so far at this point? Like, what does integration mean, and how do we do it theoretically, but also practically? And I'm curious I'm curious for you to focus on the importance of community transparency and relationships in the integration process.
Oh boy. Well, let me just tell you about one person, and we'll start from there. Community transparency, how is that possible? I'm just sort of sidetracked on that. When the ceremonies are clandestine, so please don't ask me to go there. 81-year-old man, no experience with any, with marijuana, with any psychedelic, anything, no experience in these other worlds, an engineer by training, not particularly spiritual exactly, had some therapy, was highly neurotic, very successful, decided he wanted to do an ayahuasca experience. Right out of the clear, 81 years old, all of a sudden he's going to take a powerful psychedelic, and he had to get off all his psychotropic meds that his doctor had him on. He'd been on them for 40, 50 years. I mean, it was like, are you nuts?
Well, I guess at some point you got nothing to lose, right?
Maybe.
Yeah.
And so it takes 6 months to get off all the psychiatric medication. I mean, this guy was seriously medicated. So far he's had 2 ceremonies. I mean, the good news is he's alive. I mean, how do you know? And he's developed his own approach to integration, which I think speaks so highly of how integration is very individual. But this is his brilliance, that he intuitively knew what he needed. And after the first ceremony, he used, this is an old, you probably don't even know these books because I think they're from the 60s, Ira Progoff's journaling workshops. He was sort of Jungian in orientation, and he used journaling in very structured ways to help people explore their inner aspects of themselves. Very spiritual and solid psychologically. And decades ago, this guy had one workshop in this. So he brings out this book and he's going to journal in this. This is not just journaling the way most of us think of journaling is I'll write down my dream. This is really exercises that he's doing. And so he did that after the first ceremony. After the second ceremony, he went to a flotation tank. He went into a flotation, you know how you can go in.
Yeah.
Some cities have flotation tanks.
This guy's awesome, by the way.
I know, isn't
Right?
this a hell of a story?
Yeah.
And so he entered into another altered state of consciousness in order to give him time and space to integrate the ceremony. And I thought that, I had never thought of this. This was brilliant. And then, of course, he also journaled. And so this is a relative of a family friend of mine, so I have, easy access. And I said to him, what does your 80-something-year-old wife think of this? Because she also has no experience. And this goes to the point of community and relationships. She says, and this is the best thing that's ever happened to our marriage.
Hmm.
Now, that's quite a testimonial. And so look at the uniqueness of this guy's way of working with himself. It's remarkable. And so people find their own ways, but there is something that's applicable about going into another altered state of consciousness that allows for more time without the stress of a ceremony. And by another altered state of consciousness, I don't mean another medicine or drug or anything. I mean, whether it's deep meditation or even dreaming as an altered state of consciousness, that allows the material to surface and be worked through in a more conscious kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
It's really brilliant. And then I'm very big on creative expression of any kind, so that if something can be written down or expressed in a drawing, that then you can look at it. And then it's in the outer world. It's moved from the inner world into the outer world. You can look at it in the outer world with your full prefrontal cortex, with all your cognitive abilities awake and alert, and allow that, whether it's a paragraph you're reading, the story of a dream, or you're journaling, or a drawing, it works back onto your psyche. And so there's this sense of bringing an inner world experience into the outer world, allowing it to work on you in your inner world. And there's this sense of movement from the inner world to the outer world and back again. And I think that's part of what happens when we write anything down, or we do any drawings, or anything we do, a collage, anything.
Is this somehow related to, I think it's Freud's concept of sublimation?
No.
No.
No, this is far more Jungian. I mean, if you look at the Red Book, Jung's Red Book and his now he was professionally trained as an artist, so his drawings are fabulous. But you can see that these are drawings from his inner world. I mean, he draws the spirits that he talked to. I mean, speaking about relationships with spirits. So you can actually you can encounter in his drawings his inner teacher, the spirit that he worked with and he felt who guided him through his inner world. So it's more of a Jungian approach. So it's not Freudian at all, but it's this inner movement into the outer world and then back again. And that's what this man was spontaneously doing at 80-something years old with no experience in these realms. And he feels this has changed his life. And the critical test is his wife's opinion, of course.
Right, for sure, because it goes back into this question of like I think it is a Jung quote, which is like and I'm going to butcher it a little bit, something like we always perceive ourselves on the whole to be more good than we actually are. and that
Oh boy.
our community gives us an opportunity to sort of see our blind spots.
A little reality check.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the final piece here for this interview, which has been great. Thank you very much, Rachel. I'm really appreciating this one.
Good.
All right. So the general demographic of my listeners probably aren't unfamiliar with ayahuasca. They're at least not unfamiliar with psychedelics if they've been listening to my podcast at all. But what would you say, or what would you suggest to people who either listening to this, they're like, okay, like it's time, I need to do some ayahuasca for my first time, or somebody's listening and going, this is really shifting something for me in my relationship with ayahuasca, and I want to explore this shift. What would you suggest that they look for? And what would you suggest that they steer clear of?
Well, again, let me just say, a couple of things. Well, one is finding the most authentic, careful situation possible. That for me is the biggest priority, and it's the most difficult, and it's the area where I'm least able to help people. But I feel very strongly about something I can't talk about very much, and that is that you work with someone who's really well trained. The other thing is I have to say that many people feel an inner calling, whether to try ayahuasca for the first time. I mean, I have no clue why this 80-something-year-old man went for it. But he was definitely called. People really have a calling. They really feel, they begin to have dreams about ayahuasca. They have a real sense of a calling. And so I really trust someone's inner calling. And some people, I mean, after every ceremony, I basically say never again. I mean, I say it throughout the whole ceremony. That's like my spiritual mantra, never again. So I'm a terrible, participant.
I can relate.
But some people say never again, and they really mean it. And they know this is not my medicine. And I really trust that as well. And so I trust a person's own inner sense. And no matter how many wonderful things other people are reporting, if that person's inner sense is, no, this is not for me, I really trust that. And I know for me personally, I sort of wish I'd entered into a relationship with a more fun psychedelic. Nobody's going to describe ayahuasca as fun.
Nope.
And yeah, but evidently that hasn't happened. And I found this medicine in a really synchronous way, and I trust the process, and so here I am. And so, along with my own being very conservative about what situation I'm in, I also don't mess around with anything else, frankly. So I think if someone finds their medicine, whatever it is, and that doesn't even have to be a biochemical medicine, whatever they find that is their path, I really trust that. And I would say, don't experiment for the sake of experimenting. Really follow your inner calling. So that's what I would say in response to that question.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
So you have an excellent book that I really enjoyed reading. Thank you.
Thank you.
Listening to Ayahuasca. Why don't you leave the listeners here today with where they can find out more about listening to Ayahuasca, and maybe find out more about your work in general?
Yes, so I have a website, and if they had a question, they could even write me through this website, and I do eventually answer everybody. And the website is listeningtoayahuasca.com. So it's the title of the book.com. It's easy to find me through that.
Great. And are you on any social media networks that you're using to broadcast research or your opinions or anything like that?
I mean, you can tell I'm old, so I'm very bad at social media. But I have a Facebook page, but I'm more responsive to the website.
Great. So listeningtoayahuasca.com it is. Rachel, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. It's been really fun talking with you.
Yeah, with you too. Take care.
Okay.
And so concludes episode 63 of Adventures Through the Mind, my interview with Rachel Harris. If you liked what you heard here today, definitely check out Listening to Ayahuasca, Rachel's book. It is quite good. I very much enjoyed it. Links to where you could buy that will be found in the show notes to this episode, as well as the description to this video on YouTube or podcast on your favorite podcatcher. You could also like this video if you're on YouTube, subscribe to the show on whatever catching service you are watching or listening to this too. That is a fantastic way to help boost visibility to these episodes and help other people find this content. Finally, this show is brought to you by people like yourself. It is funded primarily via my patrons on Patreon. So thank you very much to those patrons for contributing to my work and my contribution to the development of discourse around the integration of psychedelics into the modern world, as well as generally my career as a writer and I guess recently and more so as I embrace it, a psychedelic journalist. Anyone listening, if you're enjoying this show and you would like to become my patron, I do kindly invite you to do so. Anything is something and every little bit makes a huge difference, and I like to think that my rewards are pretty cool. So you can do that by head to patreon.com/James W. Jesso. You could also leave donations via PayPal or some form of cryptocurrency. Links to that are in the description to this video or this podcast, depending on where you are witnessing the show, or you can head to jameswjesso.com/support. Thank you very much, and I will see you on the next episode.